Welcome, guys.
Thanks. So, welcome to our talk. This topic is titled Kernel Exploit Sample Hunting and Mining. The reason why we chose this topic is because in this era of cyber warfare, cyber criminals always use multi-level attacks to penetrate multi-layer protected network infrastructures. We often see APT attackers manipulate zero-day Windows kernel vulnerability. So sometimes it might be surprising if we do not see this kind of zero-day kernel vulnerability used in this kind of APT attacks. Based on our analysis of past APT attacks, we realized that it is possible to identify the characteristics of these zero-day kernel vulnerabilities used by the APT attackers. So, in this topic, we will focus on how to proactively discover kernel exploit samples or the potential zero-day kernel exploit. In addition to that, we will also discuss some of the evolutions of kernel exploit that could defeat the host intrusion prevention system used by some of the software security vendors. So a quick introduction about ourselves. My name is Wayne. I'm currently working as a security researcher at Fortinet. In the last couple of years before joining Fortinet, I used to perform in-depth malware research, particularly studying anti-HITB technique used by malware against a behavioral detection system, and then providing countermeasure for those discovered techniques. But currently, I mainly focus on discovering zero-day exploit sample and also perform vulnerability research on Microsoft Office and Windows kernel. So as such, I'm extremely interested in anything related to exploit and vulnerability research. So feel free to contact me if you have anything related to this topic that you would like to exchange ideas with me. And this is my co-presenter, Broderick, and he's currently working as a senior threat analyst at F-Secure Labs, and we used to work together back in F-Secure Lab. So let's go through our agenda for this talk. Basically, this talk divided into two parts. The first part is about kernel exploit mining, while in the second part, Brod will discuss some of the elevations of privilege exploit anomalies that we observe used by zero-day kernel exploit that could be used or manipulated by us to identify the existence of kernel exploit. We will first start by giving you a context of what is elevations of privilege and user account control, which is a security feature introduced by Windows Vista and above. Typically, this USC is a security feature that limits application software to standard user privileges until administrator authorizes the elevations. For example, you will always see the Windows USC dialog box prompted that require the user interactions. In a way, EOP and USC has a common characteristic, which is always abused by malware authors. So we will briefly discuss differences between them and which one is more favorable to malware authors. Discovering zero-day kernel vulnerability through fuzzing, black box, white box static analysis, and then developing an exploit for it is a time-consuming process. So it is not surprised to see malware authors adapt the open source kernel exploit, especially those published by security researchers. Based on the results of our kernel exploit mining methodology, we realized that most of the kernel exploit used is leveraging the classic write hardware primitive. For example, the CVE 2013-3660 published by Tavis Omandi, who is currently working as a security researcher at Google Project Zero. This vulnerability is still widely or actively used by malware authors in terms of elevating the malware process privilege. So it is necessary to understand what is write hardware primitive and then we could make use. How could we make use of this write primitive to hunt for kernel exploit sample? The next one is one of the highlights of this talk, in which we will share our methodology for kernel exploit sample mining. Last but not least, we will also discuss some of the case studies of the current malware families that leverage EOP exploit. For this case study, I will only focus on DryDex and Despite, while you can get the details for the rest of the malware family from the white paper. So in this slide, you may have noticed that EOP seems to have more drawback compared to user account control. There is a saying, the great power comes with great responsibility. With EOP exploit, the exploit writer has no limitation at all because he is able to achieve arbitrary kernel code executions. However, there is no guarantee for the EOP exploit that the exploit writer deployed is 100% reliable and stable. With a single bit of instability, it could easily cause system crashes like the infamous blue screen of death. Even though it is a golden rule of thumb for exploit writer to write a reliable exploit, in reality, it is very challenging to achieve that. That's the reason why we have been observing the transition from EOP exploit to USC bypass technique, simply because the USC bypass technique is purely implemented in user mode code. So, at least it wouldn't cause system crashes in the event of program error. However, there is an easy countermeasure for all the USC bypass technique. Basically, what you can do is you can go to the user account control setting and adjust the setting to always notify. After that, regardless of any USC bypass technique that you use or the malware deployed, the user will always receive this Windows USC bypass, Windows USC dialog box prompted. So at least it wouldn't, at least it gives the user a chance to deny the operation and stop the malware. Unfortunately, this setting is not set by default on Windows, and it is very unlikely for the user to adjust to this setting because user might think that it might be too annoying to get too many Windows prompts whenever the user trying to execute some program that require administrator privilege. However, based on my own experience, it is not as bad as you expected because Microsoft has done a great job in making this security feature less invasive. So it is strongly recommended to enable this security feature immediately right after this talk. Having said that, the EOP exploits provide full system privilege. It means the exploit process will be running as a system integrity level. While for the USC bypass technique, it provides an administrator privilege, which is a high integrity level. So in a nutshell, we can say that EOP exploit is more powerful as compared to USC bypass technique. That's also the reason why we have been observing a lot of malware families adapting the EOP exploit, particularly those open source ones with reliable success rate. But in fact, to improve malware's reliability, malware authors started to adapt both of these elevation methods at the same time, depending on the current user permissions. Basically, based on this simple flowchart, if the current user is not running as an administrator account, the EOP exploit will be deployed first. Otherwise, the integrity level of the malware process will be determined instead. A low or medium integrity level is a typical integrity level used by standard Windows applications that indicates it does not have sufficient privileges whenever the program trying to access to some of the restricted resources. If that is the case, the USC bypass technique will be deployed instead. In the event of unsuccessful USC bypass technique being deployed, the EOP exploit will be triggered instead before the main payload is executed. Keep in mind that these two branches pointed by the arrow will only be taken if the current user is administrator. In other words, the USC bypass technique is applicable to administrator account only. So that's the reason why the malware orders adapt both of these elevation methods at the same time to improve its reliability and success rate of elevating the malware process privilege. So what is write wire primitive? I believe some of you guys might already know what is write wire primitive. Because we want to give a context to other fellow to understand the kernel exploit mining methodology that we are going to introduce later, it is necessary to discuss a bit what is write wire primitive. So I will go through this very quickly. Basically, write wire primitive is a most commonly used vector. It is a simple and most straightforward kernel exploitation technique which is widely used by exploit writer. Essentially, it allows an exploit writer to store a specific value to a specific kernel pointer address. For example, and the classic target for write wire primitive scenario is how dispatch table exploited by NDOS kernel. And generally, a traditional kernel exploit could be constructed using 3 simple steps. First, the exploit writer could prepare a user mode buffer to store the shellcode. If there is an arbitrary write kernel while NetBreedy exceeds, the exploit writer could use a write wire approach to override the how dispatch table with the shellcode address that it obtained in the first step. After that, in order to trigger the shellcode from the kernel mode, the exploit writer could call anti-query interval profile functions in order to redirect the code execution to the prepared shellcodes in the exploit program. Obviously, write wire primitive is the simplest form of kernel exploitation techniques, but it has its own limitation as well. Thanks to supervisor mode execution prevention and supervisor mode access preventions technology introduced by Intel since Windows 8 and above. Basically, machine with SMAP enable does not allow user mode memory execution from kernel mode code. If you still recall from the previous slide, it effectively means that the third step where the exploit writer trying to trigger the user mode shellcode from the kernel mode code is no longer possible starting on Windows 8 and above. However, in the security world, security researchers always come out with workaround to tackle the issue that they encounter, and there is no exception for SMAP as well. There are various known techniques to bypass SMAP, and one of the good examples is demonstrated by NetForce exploit in CV 2015-0058. But in my own opinion, there is a more generic method to bypass SMAP, which is in which the exploit writer could allocate a kernel mode executable buffer replacing the user mode buffer storing the shellcode, which is well explained by Alex NSQ kernel heap function technique. But keep in mind that Alex technique can only work until Windows 8. Nevertheless, what I'm trying to emphasize here is how prominent is write wire primitive to exploit writer because of its simplicity. But in fact, not all kernel exploit use write wire primitive, as demonstrated by the exploit in CV 2014-4113 and 2015-1701. Because of the fact that not all kernel exploit call anti-query interval profile functions in order to achieve arbitrary kernel code execution, so it may make our kernel exploit mining methodology not generic enough to cover all the kernel exploit samples. However, the use of this API function together with how dispatch table is still favorable to us in the events of mining kernel exploit sample, and it has been proven to be useful in discovering some zero-day kernel exploit. Some of the success stories are, for example, the discovery of Broderick CV 2015-0057 exploit, which was first reported by Udi Yawu to Microsoft and then later exploited by Broderick while there was no public exploit code available during that time. Another example is the discovery of other malware family leverage the public known EOP exploit as a result of our kernel exploit mining methodology. So basically, how do we do that? What we do is we look for the Windows kernel API function name statically and dynamically. These Windows kernel API function name are most of the time hard-coded in the binary and can be conveniently searched from process memory. So the string search from the process memory through dynamic analysis system like Sandbox could come in handy in mining this kind of kernel exploit sample. However, there are some cases where these Windows kernel API functions are not hard-coded in the binary. For example, the malware might use some code prowl technique to implement its own getproc address routine and pass the import table manually in order to retrieve the function address directly needed by the exploit. To address these cases, we introduce some of the kernel exploit behavior detection methods that will be explained by Brod in the anomaly sections. So we will first discuss the generic way on how to identify write-what-where primitive exploit, kernel exploit sample. The following screenshot should be no stranger to anyone who is familiar with Yararu. And this is an example of VD Yararu that we implemented to look for the write-what-where primitive kernel exploit sample from static binary. One of the killer features of Yara is that it enables us to scan the string pattern from the process memory as well. So, to improve the efficiency of this Yararu against packed or encrypted malware, you might want to deploy this Yararu to your dynamic analysis system that support Yara. As I mentioned previously, the use of write-what-where primitive is still very favorable to us in the events of mining majority of kernel exploit samples. To reiterate again, after successfully exploiting a kernel vulnerability, the exploit process will need to call anti-query interval profile function in order to transfer the code execution to an arbitrary address under attacker's control, which is overwritten at how dispatch table via some arbitrary write kernel vulnerability. And keep in mind that the use of this anti-query interval profile function is not common to be found by user mode applications. Hence, it is safe to say that if this Windows kernel API functions is found in a binary or process memory, we could say that it potentially contains kernel exploit. Currently, we are applying this Yararu on VirusTotal and the result looks quite promising with very low FP rate. Of course, you can reduce the number of false positives by adding additional conditions. For example, we skip scanning Windows driver file in this case, which might have the potential of using or calling these anti-query interval profile functions. To recap, not all kernel exploits use write-what-where primitive. So, how can we deal with these other exceptional cases? In order to do that, we need to first understand what is the typical post-kernel exploit payload used by exploit process. Traditionally, after exploiting a kernel vulnerability, an exploit process will typically elevate itself to system privilege through token stealing. In other words, we could take advantage of the token stealing payload operations. And these token stealing operations could be summarized in 3 simple steps. First, the exploit process could get the eProcess structure of the system process with process ID equals 4 and subsequently obtain its corresponding SS token address. And after that, the exploit process will get the eProcess structure of itself and then replace its SS token address with the system SS token. As a result of this token replacement, the exploit process will contain the same access level as a system process, which is a full system privilege. Traditionally, all of these steps are implemented in pure assembly code that would require some constant offset to be used to find the actual SS token address, which is one of the fields from the eProcess structure, and also traversing the active process list to find the system process and also retrieving other type of hard-coded information. But the kernel exploit these days would use documented Windows kernel API functions to implement or perform all these steps to improve its resilience and portability. This is an example of a privilege elevation payload routine taken from modern exploit. Obviously, it looks cleaner and more portable. Basically, what these two pieces of code trying to do here is that it first try to call the documented Windows kernel API functions called PS lookup process by process ID. Later, it will adjust the offset of the eProcess structure in order to get the token address, which is one of the fields from the eProcess structure. And usually the exploit writer would use constant offset that support different versions of Windows OS. Alternatively, from the screenshot on the right hand side, a more elegant approach would be calling PS reference primary tokens API functions with the eProcess structure as its first input parameter that can conveniently retrieve the token address for the respective exploit process and the system process. After the token address has been determined, the exploit process will change its access token with the system access token to achieve elevations of privilege. Hence, we introduced the second Yara rule to detect the subset of the kernel exploit sample that do not leverage write what were primitive. In this rule, we take advantage of the token stealing operations that will call the documented Windows kernel API functions like PS lookup process by process ID and anti-query system information, which is typically used by all sorts of kernel exploit to retrieve the NTOS kernel base address that would be required in parsing the actual kernel address for the respective kernel function that would be required by the exploit. Logically, this PS lookup process by process ID is not allowed to be used by any user mode application directly. So, the use of this documented Windows kernel API function by any user mode application attempting to exploit a Windows kernel vulnerability could be a good indicator for us. It is also worth to mention that this Yara rule is more aggressive, but it is able to find the token stealing operation that presented from the code figure shown previously. Again, additional condition can be added to this rule to make it less false positive. For example, we have also added checks where the sample has imported GDI32 and user32 libraries that contain the GUI functions which are typically used when exploiting Win32k vulnerabilities. We also introduced a third Yara rule to detect the token stealing operation that involve calling another documented Windows kernel API function called PS reference primary token. This rule is identical to the previous one, except it is not specific in detecting samples exploiting Win32k vulnerabilities. As you can see in the condition part, we dropped the user32 and GDI32 import libraries checks. Next, we are going to talk some of the case study of the current malware family that leverage the EOP exploit. This malware family was discovered by the first Yara rule that we introduced. And the reason why we picked Ritex as one of the notable malware family that we want to discuss here is because it was the first malware family that exploits CV 2015-0057 3 months after Microsoft patched the vulnerability in February 2015. It is also worth to mention that there was no public exploit code available during the time. So we believe that this EOP exploit could be developed by Ritex authors through patch analysis, or they bought the EOP exploit from the underground market. Nevertheless, After the disclosures of FireEye blog posts regarding the use of EOP exploit by Broderick, we realized that the EOP exploit has been disappeared from Broderick in July 2015. Soon after that, we only discovered that Broderick has been evolved. It now supports modular architecture, in which the EOP exploit can be downloaded as a module from the CNC as Mode 5. Currently, we are actively monitoring the EOP exploit in Mode 5, but the result is quite disappointing because the EOP exploit in Mode 5 seems to be the same exploit as we first discovered back in April 2015. Broderick is one of the good examples to show how malware authors react to improve their product. As I mentioned previously, to improve the malware's reliability, Broderick also include the USC bypass technique in addition to the EOP exploit in order to elevate the malware process privilege. For Broderick, its USC bypass module can be downloaded from the CNC as Mode 4. Fortunately, it is currently exploiting a very old and known USC vulnerability, which is already patched by Microsoft. In case if you are interested, the USC vulnerability is currently exploiting is called AppCompat whitelisting. The next case study is DSpy. I believe no one has heard about this malware family before because this is not a very prevalent malware family that first appeared in 2014. It was also discovered by the first Yara that we introduced. The reason why this malware family stands out from the rest of the malware family is because of its interesting post-kernel exploit payload. After exploiting a kernel vulnerability, DSpy malware did not elevate the malware process privilege. Instead, it used not a new technique, but rather interesting approach. So we started to ask ourselves, do we really need to elevate the privileges for the exploit process? This question seems to be answered by Cesar Cheruto in his presentations of easy local Windows kernel exploitations. In his presentation, he introduced a couple of approaches for Windows kernel exploitation, and one of his approaches suggests that exploit writer could nullify a DSCR of a security descriptor for a privileged Windows process. After that, a low or medium integrity level of the exploit process could inject its payload to a higher privileged Windows process without any restrictions. However, these approaches introduced by Cesar Cheruto require some modification to kernel data structure that could be easily detected by security software. In response to this, DSpy malware decided to inject code to the remote process from kernel mode. One of the biggest advantages of this approach is that there is no modification needed to the kernel data structure, and at the same time, it enables code execution under kernel mode context. Basically, how it works is that after exploiting a kernel vulnerability, the exploit process could execute an RPC injection routine from the kernel mode directly, and the responsibility of this RPC injection routine is to traverse the active process list to find the target process, which is very unlikely to be monitored by heaps, for example, SVC hosts. After the target process was found, the exploit process could inject an RPC thread to the target process in order to run the main payload. Obviously, this approach is more stealthy, and based on our testing, it is able to bypass most of the heap solution by anti-malware vendors. Interestingly, last month, Trend Micro also discovered the similar post-kernel exploit payload used by Locky, which is a notorious ransomware, in order to elevate the malware process privilege. This is a workflow of workflow of the post-kernel exploit payload used by DSpy. The DSpy malware will first exploit the vulnerability specified in CVE 2013-3660. After the DSpy malware successfully exploiting the vulnerability, it then transfers the control to kernel mode. And in the kernel mode, it will first allocate the kernel buffer while EX allocate pool. After the kernel buffer is ready, it then write and prepare an APC injection routine to the kernel buffer that it allocated previously. After that, it transfers the code execution to the kernel buffer. And as I mentioned previously, the responsibility of this APC injector routine is to enumerate and find the active SVC host process and then inject an APC thread to the target process. And finally, the APC thread will be triggered while the KE insert Q APC function that will perform the final downloader or dropper routine. Next, I'm going to pass the stage to Brod to explain the EOP exploit anomalies that can be used to identify the kernel mode, the kernel exploit.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. So now I'm going to discuss those anomalies that may suggest that an elevated process is not authorized. So first is the existence of user processes that have system integrity level. According to MSDN, the processes that are started by the user acquire the integrity level of the user. Only system services are assigned system integrity level. So if we look at a normal system, so we will notice that only system services have like system integrity level, and user processes have like integrity level of the user. For example, let's say we run calculator. So it will have a medium integrity level because by default users have medium integrity level unless they are admin users that have authorized through UAC. For example, let's re-execute it again, but as administrator. So now it has a high integrity level. So now let us use a local kernel debugger to simulate like a malware reach the kernel mode and what it can do. So in our case, we want to elevate this medium integrity level to system. So as discussed by Wayne, one of the technique that is commonly used by malware is to just steal the token of the system process. But before we are able to do that, since we are not using the documented API, so we need to increment the reference count. Otherwise, we will risk blue screening the system after our process terminates. So the reference count is located at the object header. Object header of the access token. So let's see. So it's located at offset 0. So now we need to get the address of the access token of the system process. So this is the access. So this is the address of the access token of the system process. So now we need to get the address of its object header. So it's located here. So now we want to change the value. It's located at 0, so yeah, so we don't need that. At this point, we don't know how many existing references are there, so we cannot simply just change it to 2D or whatever. But there's a brilliant technique that was suggested by Cesar Cerrudo, is to simply set this to set it with a value that is big. That way, we ensure that the access token is not freed even after our process exits. So for example, let's set it to 300 hex. So now we can replace the access token of calculator to the access token of the system process. So first we need to get the offset of the field. So it is located at the process object. So the token is located at offset F8. So we simply need to get the address of the calculator object in memory. So it's here. So we want to change the token field, which is in offset F8. So we want to set it to the token of the system process. So now when we restart like Process Explorer, then it should be it should have system integrity level. So now it has system integrity level. So what does this mean? Well, it means it shouldn't be there because obviously it's not a system service, and it is a child of Explorer.exe, so which means it's most probably launched by a user. But the problem with this is that there's no definitive way to determine whether a process is a system service or not. But of course, there are also ways to check. Like, one is the parent should not be Explorer.exe, or if it's a system service, then its parent should be services.exe. But with this approach, then we need to consider that there are processes that are started by Windows at startup. So that means that some form of whitelisting is needed. So therefore, a more generic way or a more generic check that we can a more generic check that we can use is, instead of checking the process name, we check the integrity level. So if it's system integrity, if it has system integrity level, then its parent should also have system integrity level. So for example, like a normal process like SVC host, it has a system integrity level. So its parent should also have system integrity level. So now calc has system integrity level, but its parent, Explorer.exe, is only medium integrity level. So we have discussed like how to determine an anomaly through integrity levels. But as Wayne mentioned earlier, malware doesn't really need to elevate to a higher integrity level. There are other ways. One of them is to directly acquire the system, the necessary privileges. So let's use OLIDebug, for example, as example. So we have executed it as medium integrity level. So it wouldn't be able to, so it will only be able to access processes with medium integrity level. But now let us assume again it was able to reach kernel mode through an exploit. So it reached the kernel mode and able to acquire the SE debug privilege. The SE debug privilege is basically it basically grants a process access to all processes regardless of the integrity level. So the the privileges is located at the access token. So it's located at offset 40, and it's using this structure. It's called SEP token privileges, and it contains this field present, which contains a value that with each bit representing the privilege. So if we quickly take a look in the privileges of only debug, so the present field means like what are the bits that are present, or what are the privileges that are present. For the enable field, it corresponds to which of the bits are enabled. So in this case, it's SE change notify privilege, only this one. So now we want to actually, there's a research by Cesar Cerrudo. Apparently, the present field is not being checked at all in the kernel mode. In kernel mode. So if we want, we just need to set the SE debug privilege in the enable field. So now let's get the access token of only debug. So that's the access token, and we want to set the privileges, which is in offset 40. So we want to modify the privileges field of the access token, and then the enable field of the privileges. So it's at offset 8. The SE debug field, SE debug privilege just field is bit number 20. So that's equivalent to 100,000 hex. So in this case, we just need to OR it. So basically, that's equal to 900,000 hex. I've pre-computed it already before coming here. So now, when we go back to OLI, then it has access to all the processes, but it still has the medium integrity level. In normal circumstances, let's just close this. In normal circumstances, processes that have medium or low integrity level are not able to acquire admin privileges. So we have a test binary here, or a demo binary here. So it will try to acquire the SE debug privilege using the adjust token privileges API. So if we, for example, we run it with high integrity level. So high integrity level, if we quickly take a look, it has the SE debug privileges present, but it's disabled by default. So if we let it continue, if we check again, then it was able to acquire the privilege. But if we run it with medium integrity level, then it doesn't even have the SE debug privileges present. So eventually, so if we let it continue, of course it will fail. So what this means is that we can use it as a check. There shouldn't be any processes that have admin privileges, but only has medium or low system integrity level. Another thing that malware can do without elevating to a higher integrity level is to tamper with the protection of the target object. So let's use actually that was mentioned by Wayne earlier, so but let's do a demo. So let's use, let's say, let's launch calculator as our target. So it is in high integrity level. So now if we launch only debug with medium integrity level, so naturally it won't be able to access calculator because it's in a higher integrity level. Again, let's just assume it was able to reach kernel mode and able to tamper with the security descriptor of calculator. So basically, security descriptor contains all the security information of an object, or in this case, of calculator. The security descriptor is located at the object header. So it's located at offset 14. Yeah, according to MSDN, the security descriptor a null security descriptor practically grants everyone access to the object. So in our case, we want to set the security descriptor of our target, which is calculator.exe, to 0 or to null. So we need to get the calculator process object. So now we try to get the address of its object header. So it's located here. Now we want to set the security descriptor field, which is in offset 14. Now we set it to 0. If we quickly take a look at the permissions of calc, it has no permission set now. So it practically gives anyone access to it. So that means like when we come back here, we reload it, then calc is already accessible, even though it's in a higher integrity level. Where am I? So therefore, a more generic. So as a summary, malware does not need to elevate to a higher integrity level. They can just either acquire the necessary privileges, like the SE debug privilege, or it can also tamper with the secure or remove the protection from its target object. There could be other techniques that have not been discovered yet. Therefore, a more generic check is to simply check for processes trying to access objects that have higher integrity level, because that is the core of the Windows integrity mechanism. So if something is violating that one, then it means that something fishy is going on. So when anomalies exist, specifically we have elevated processes that are not authorized, it means that they were able to acquire them illegally. For example, they exploited a vulnerability, a kernel vulnerability. So this means that the process of finding these processes also assists in the hunting process. So as a conclusion, it usually means game over when someone reaches the kernel mode, because we've been talking about anomalies. But once the malware reach kernel mode, they can practically do anything. They can remove all the anomalies, but it will only take them more effort and more time. So for us, we should not make it easy for them. So we should try our best to take advantage of these anomalies as much as possible, as long as possible, and find this sample to come up with a solution. So I hope you find our presentation interesting. So thank you. Thank you all. Any questions for Wayne and Broderick? Is that clear?
Any questions for Broderick and Wayne from the audience? Yeah.
So the technique with the APC, where like you just launch an APC in a privileged process.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen malware that just stays in APCs, that just keeps living through APCs rather than injecting itself into a process? Like it executes an APC, then it spawns another APC in the same process and keeps on going.
That is an interesting idea, but we haven't encountered any, at least based on my knowledge, I haven't encountered any real-world malware that are doing this at this moment. But yeah, it's quite interesting, the idea.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I have no strong opinion.
Any other questions? No. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.